I remember the day so clearly because it started so ordinary. Coffee in my hand, badge clipped neatly to my blouse. I was on autopilot, smiling at familiar faces in the lobby, rehearsing my mental checklist for the morning meeting. It was one of those Tuesdays where nothing remarkable was supposed to happen. And then the visitor walked in. He looked a little lost, scanning the directory with his briefcase held close to his chest. There was a kind of hesitation about him, like someone who didn't quite trust he belonged here. I noticed, almost immediately, the hearing aids behind his ears and the way he kept avoiding the receptionist's voice. That was the moment it clicked he was deaf. Without thinking, I walked up and signed a simple greeting. Hello. Do you need help? His eyes widened. Relief, gratitude, and something softer, like the burden of being misunderstood had just lifted, washed across his face. He smiled and replied in sign language so quick, so fluid, I almost stumbled to keep up. But I did. Somehow I did. It wasn't a grand gesture. Just two strangers bridging a gap most people never bother to cross. But in the hush of that lobby, it felt intimate, almost sacred. We shared a moment where words weren't necessary, where kindness wasn't loud, but deeply seen. And then I felt it, that prickle on the back of my neck, the sense of being watched. I turned and there he was, the CEO, standing silently inside the glass elevator, mid-descent, his gaze locked on us. Not blinking, not smiling, just watching. In that instant, my heart sank. I didn't know if I had crossed some invisible line, if I had broken some unspoken rule about professionalism, or made myself too visible in the wrong way. My palms grew damp. My breath caught, because what I didn't know yet, what I couldn't have guessed, was that this small act, this simple conversation in sign language, was about to unravel secrets in the company I had never dreamed existed. Kindness can look so ordinary in the moment until you realize someone powerful was watching. I had been with the company for just under 2 years. Long enough to understand its rhythms, short enough to still feel like a guest in someone else's house. It was one of those firms where everything gleamed just a little too much. Marble in the lobby, glass-walled offices, polished smiles. Our CEO, Mr. Grayson, was more legend than man. People whispered about him more than they spoke to him, and his decisions rippled through the building like weather patterns no one could control. Me? I was middle management, tucked away in a department that didn't draw much attention. I was careful. I kept my head down, did my work, and made sure not to stand out. Not in a company where standing out usually meant being burned by the spotlight. But that morning in the lobby when I signed to that visitor, I wasn't thinking about strategy or appearances. It was instinct. My younger brother is deaf, and growing up, I had learned sign language as naturally as learning to tie my shoes. For me, it wasn't a skill, it was family. So when I saw the visitor struggling, my hands moved before my brain reminded me to be cautious. He told me his name was Daniel. He was there for a meeting on the 20th floor, but the receptionist had been rattling off instructions too fast for him to follow. He looked relieved when I guided him to the right bank of elevators, fingers spelling his floor number with an ease that felt like home. As the doors closed behind him, I exhaled. A small, private act of kindness, nothing more. Except for the eyes in the glass elevator. Eyes that belonged to the man at the very top. When Mr. Grayson finally stepped off at the lobby level, his gaze brushed over me. Just a second too long, too unreadable. No smile, no nod. Just a glance heavy enough to pin me in place. Then he was gone, his assistant trailing behind him like a shadow. I stood frozen, clutching my coffee cup, the echo of Daniel's grateful smile still warming me, and the weight of the CEO's silence pressing down harder. Because sometimes silence is louder than words, and I couldn't shake the feeling that mine had just been tested. The rest of that morning, I tried to convince myself it was nothing. CEOs see everything. Maybe he was just curious. Maybe he hadn't even registered what he saw. But as the hours ticked on, the silence of that glance grew heavier in my mind. By mid-afternoon, an email landed in my inbox. Short. Formal. From the executive assistant. Mr. Grayson requests your presence at 4 p.m. Conference room A. My stomach flipped. I had never been summoned to meet him before. People joked that you either prayed for such an invitation or feared it. At 3:55, I walked into conference room A. It was cavernous, windows stretching floor to ceiling, the city spread out beneath us like a map. Mr. Grayson was already there, standing at the far end of the long mahogany table. No laptop, no papers. Just him. Sit, he said, motioning with a hand that was both casual and commanding. I obeyed, my pulse hammering. He studied me for a long moment. Then, you know sign language? It wasn't a question. Yes, I said quietly. My brother is deaf. Something flickered in his expression. Not warmth, not exactly, but something less cold than I expected. He leaned back against the table, arms folded. Tell me, he said, why did you stop to help the man this morning? You could have walked past. Most would have. The air tightened around me. I hesitated, then answered as simply as I could. Because he needed help. And I could. The silence that followed was unbearable. Then, at last, he nodded once, as if confirming some private calculation. Good, he said. We'll see if that answer holds. Before I could ask what he meant, he laid down the terms like a judge setting a trial. Over the next few weeks, I would be asked to assist visitors, clients, and colleagues in unpredictable situations. He would be watching, always watching. It wasn't about performance metrics or quarterly goals. It was something else, something quieter, deeper. A test of character. A test where the rules weren't written anywhere, except in the small choices I would make. And I left that room realizing the real examination had already begun. Because sometimes the true test isn't about skill at all. It's about who you choose to be when no one tells you the rules. The days that followed felt like walking through a maze I hadn't agreed to enter. Every corner seemed to hold a mirror, every hallway an invisible camera. I began to notice things I hadn't before, moments that seemed insignificant until I remembered Mr. Grayson's words. We'll see if that answer holds. On Wednesday, it was the delivery man. He struggled with a dolly stacked with boxes, the elevator doors threatening to close before he could get them through. Most people streamed past, too busy, too distracted. I caught the door with my foot and helped him steady the load. He muttered a surprised thanks. A shadow shifted on the mezzanine above. I didn't have to look to know who stood there. Thursday brought a different puzzle. A junior analyst, red-faced, dropped a stack of printouts in the hallway, hundreds of pages scattering like snow. People stepped around her, annoyed. I crouched down, gathering papers with her until her breathing slowed, her panic fading. When we finished, she gave me a look that lingered. As I stood, I caught the faint reflection of the CEO in the glass wall nearby. Watching. Always watching. By Friday, I realized these weren't coincidences. They were staged somehow. Or, at least curated. Grayson was engineering moments, setting pieces in motion to see whether I would pause, notice, act. The strangest part? Each time I did, I felt that same warmth I'd felt in the lobby with Daniel. That quiet certainty that small kindness mattered, even when it seemed no one else cared. But the puzzles grew more complex. One afternoon, I received an interoffice envelope with no sender. Inside was a single object, a silk scarf. Pale blue, delicately embroidered, faintly scented with lavender. No note. No instructions. Just the scarf. I turned it over in my hands, unsettled. It felt like a symbol, but of what? A test of vanity? A riddle to solve? I kept it folded in my desk drawer, unsure if, or when, I'd be asked about it. Because I was starting to understand. In this game Grayson had set, nothing was random. Every detail had meaning. And the smallest choices would add up to something larger, something I still couldn't see. Kindness, it seemed, had become a puzzle with pieces scattered in plain sight, waiting for me to decide how to put them together. It was the following Monday when the pieces began to shift into focus. I had just stepped out of a client briefing when I saw him, Daniel, the deaf visitor from that first day. Only this time, he wasn't alone. He was seated in a conference room across the hall, speaking in sign to a small group of executives. And beside him, like a sentinel, stood Mr. Grayson. I froze. Watching through the glass, I realized something startling. Daniel wasn't a visitor. He was a consultant. And not just any consultant. He was the CEO's nephew. The revelation landed with weight. This hadn't been a random encounter at all. My act of kindness in the lobby hadn't just been noticed. It had been the spark that lit this entire test. Later that afternoon, I was summoned again. Not to the grand conference room this time, but to Mr. Grayson's private office. The walls were lined with books, family photos, and artifacts that hinted at a life lived far beyond corporate boardrooms. At the center of it all was a framed photo, a young boy with hearing aids, grinning at the camera. Daniel. Grayson gestured for me to sit. "You've met my nephew," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "He's brilliant. He sees patterns most of us miss. But he's had to fight to be heard his whole life." I nodded, unsure where this was leading. He leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "You helped him without hesitation. Not because of who he is, but because of who you are. That is what I needed to know." The scarf surfaced then. He opened a drawer and pulled out an identical one, draping it across his desk. "My late wife's," he explained. "She believed small acts of grace mattered more than grand gestures. I've been leaving them with certain people, watching how they treat what cannot be explained. Do they dismiss it? Hide it? Treasure it?" His eyes flicked toward me. "You didn't throw it away." My throat tightened. I didn't know what it meant. You weren't meant to. Not yet. And there it was. The revelation I hadn't expected. This wasn't about sign language or even kindness alone. It was about character when things don't make sense. The scarf, the puzzles, the staged moments, they were echoes of his wife's quiet philosophy, a philosophy he wanted to preserve inside the cold machinery of his company. I walked out of that office shaken, carrying more questions than answers. Because now I knew I wasn't just being tested for myself. I was being measured against the memory of someone I had never met. And memories, I realized, can be heavier than expectations. It was the following Monday when the pieces began to shift into focus. I had just stepped out of a client briefing when I saw him, Daniel, the deaf visitor from that first day. Only this time, he wasn't alone. He was seated in a conference room across the hall, speaking in sign to a small group of executives. And beside him, like a sentinel, stood Mr. Grayson. I froze. Watching through the glass, I realized something startling. Daniel wasn't a visitor. He was a consultant. And not just any consultant. He was the CEO's nephew. The revelation landed with weight. This hadn't been a random encounter at all. My act of kindness in the lobby hadn't just been noticed. It had been the spark that lit this entire test. Later that afternoon, I was summoned again. Not to the grand conference room this time, but to Mr. Grayson's private office. The walls were lined with books, family photos, and artifacts that hinted at a life lived far beyond corporate boardrooms. At the center of it all was a framed photo, a young boy with hearing aids, grinning at the camera. Daniel. Grayson gestured for me to sit. "You've met my nephew," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "He's brilliant. He sees patterns most of us miss. But he's had to fight to be heard his whole life." I nodded, unsure where this was leading. He leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "You helped him without hesitation. Not because of who he is, but because of who you are. That is what I needed to know." The scarf surfaced then. He opened a drawer and pulled out an identical one, draping it across his desk. "My late wife's," he explained. "She believed small acts of grace mattered more than grand gestures. I've been leaving them with certain people, watching how they treat what cannot be explained. Do they dismiss it? Hide it? Treasure it?" His eyes flicked toward me. "You didn't throw it away." My throat tightened. I didn't know what it meant. You weren't meant to. Not yet. And there it was. The revelation I hadn't expected. This wasn't about sign language, or even kindness alone. It was about character when things don't make sense. The scarf, the puzzles, the staged moments, they were echoes of his wife's quiet philosophy, a philosophy he wanted to preserve inside the cold machinery of his company. I walked out of that office shaken, carrying more questions than answers. Because now I knew I wasn't just being tested for myself. I was being measured against the memory of someone I had never met. And memories, I realized, can be heavier than expectations. After that revelation, nothing in the office looked the same. Every interaction felt loaded, like a line in a play where I didn't know my role. I began to notice details I'd once ignored. The way people lowered their voices when Grayson passed, the way certain employees stiffened whenever Daniel's name was mentioned. The tests didn't stop, they deepened. One afternoon, I found a junior colleague crying quietly in the break room, her phone clutched to her chest. Her father had been admitted to the hospital, but her supervisor had refused to let her leave early. I offered to cover her workload, knowing it meant staying until midnight myself. She hugged me, trembling. As I turned to reassure her, I saw the faint reflection of Mr. Grayson in the vending machine glass. Watching. Another time, Daniel himself approached me. He signed quickly, nervously, about a proposal he was preparing. He wanted feedback before presenting it to the board. It wasn't polished, raw, a little chaotic, but his ideas were sharp. I gave him my honest thoughts, gently phrased, and stayed late to help him shape it. That night, as we packed up, he signed something that made me pause. "You don't treat me like I'm a test." The words lingered long after I left the building. But kindness, I was learning, wasn't without cost. Colleagues began whispering, "Why is she spending so much time with Daniel? How did she get close to the CEO?" I overheard the questions, sharp as pins. My reputation, the one I had carefully built on quiet competence, was shifting into something else. Envy. Suspicion. The scarf appeared again, too. One morning, it was draped over my chair in the conference room. No one claimed it. No one mentioned it. But I felt the eyes on me as I folded it carefully and tucked it away. Later that week, I found yet another, pale blue and faintly scented, left in the pocket of my coat. The symbolism pressed on me. Was I passing or failing? Treasuring or clinging? It reached a breaking point during a quarterly review. In front of senior managers, Grayson asked me directly to present on Daniel's proposal, one I had only helped refine. My name wasn't on it, but my fingerprints were everywhere. Every eye in that room turned toward me. If I claimed the credit, I'd rise fast. If I deferred, I risked looking invisible again. My palms were damp, my throat tight. I had to decide, not just what answer would keep me safe, but what answer would keep me true. Because sometimes, the test isn't in the puzzle itself, it's in whether you'll betray your own reflection while solving it. The boardroom that afternoon felt more like an arena than a meeting space. Long glass table, leather chairs pulled tight, city skyline looming behind us like an indifferent audience. I had been here before, but never in the hot glare of everyone's attention. Mr. Grayson sat at the head, his hands folded, face unreadable. Daniel was present too, across the table, eyes flicking nervously between me and his uncle. Around us, a semicircle of senior managers waited, their expressions sharpened with curiosity or suspicion. "Go ahead," Grayson said, his tone deceptively mild. "Present the proposal." My pulse thundered. I knew this was the moment every whisper in the office had been preparing for. The choice. The trap. The test. I stood slowly, Daniel's notes in front of me, the scarf folded neatly in my bag. I could claim it. I had shaped these ideas into something coherent. The managers would nod, impressed. My career would rocket upward in ways I had never dared imagine. But then my eyes met Daniel's. He signed something small, almost imperceptible, hidden from the others. "Yours?" It wasn't a question about ownership, it was about honesty. About whether I would betray the truth in front of the very man who had been measuring me from the shadows. I cleared my throat. "This," I began, my voice steadier than I felt, "is Daniel's proposal. His vision, his insight. I only had the privilege of helping him shape it for presentation. The credit belongs to him." The room shifted. A few brows arched. A murmur of disapproval rippled at the edges. This wasn't how the game was supposed to be played. But Grayson leaned back, eyes narrowing, not in anger, but in something closer to satisfaction. Daniel's shoulders eased, his hands folding neatly on the table, gratitude written all over his face. Still, the confrontation wasn't over. One of the managers, a man named Collins, spoke up sharply. With respect, sir, if she's doing this much work behind the scenes, shouldn't we be evaluating her role more critically? People who hide behind others' names can be dangerous. The words stung, cold and deliberate. I opened my mouth to protest, but Grayson raised a hand, silencing the room. Dangerous? He repeated slowly, his gaze locked on Collins. Or trustworthy? The silence that followed was deafening. I realized then, this wasn't just my confrontation, it was Grayson's too. A clash between two visions of leadership. One built on credit and ambition, the other on unseen acts of loyalty. And in that moment, the entire room waited to see which side he would choose. Because sometimes the sharpest battles are fought not with fists or voices, but with the quiet courage to tell the truth when it costs you the most. Grayson's silence stretched so long I could hear the hum of the lights above us. Finally, he stood, slow and deliberate, like a man placing the last piece of a puzzle. Collins, he said, his tone like glass cracking, you've just revealed more about yourself than I ever needed to know. His gaze swept the room, steady, unyielding. This company has thrived on people grabbing for credit, taking shortcuts, pretending that leadership is louder than humility. But my wife believed something different. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a folded scarf, pale blue, embroidered, the same lavender scent I knew so well. He laid it flat on the table. She believed that the smallest acts, the ones no one applauds, are the true measure of a person. That's why I've been watching, testing, waiting. His eyes found mine then, and for the first time, they softened. And today, she would have smiled. I felt heat rise in my throat. The scarf in my bag seemed to grow heavier, more precious. Daniel signed something quickly, his hands trembling. She would be proud. Grayson gave the faintest nod, as though acknowledging both of us. Then he turned back to the managers. If you want to know the future of this company, stop looking at who talks the loudest. Look at who helps the quietest. This young woman has shown more integrity in a month than some of you have in a career. The message was unmistakable. Whatever suspicion, whatever envy had gathered around me, it dissolved under the weight of his words. After the meeting, as people filed out, Grayson paused by my chair. He didn't speak, just placed the scarf from the table into my hands. A legacy passed like a torch. Later, Daniel caught me in the hallway. He signed with a small, earnest smile. You didn't just pass his test. You changed it. I realized then the legacy wasn't about promotion or status, or even approval. It was about carrying forward the belief that small kindness changes everything, sometimes even the shape of an entire company. Because the final reveal wasn't that I had been chosen. It was that I had been trusted. And trust, once given, is the most powerful inheritance of all. In the weeks that followed, life at the office found a new rhythm. The whispers that once stung with suspicion shifted into something quieter, respect, curiosity, even admiration. I didn't become a vice president overnight, and I didn't suddenly sit at the head of the table. But something more important happened. People started noticing the little things. The analyst who once scattered papers in the hallway? Others now bent down to help her without hesitation. The delivery man? He didn't struggle alone anymore. And the junior colleague with her sick father? She returned to work to find a team that had covered her load together. The culture was shifting, one scarf, one gesture, one act of unseen kindness at a time. As for me, I kept that lavender-scented scarf folded neatly in my desk drawer. On hard days, I'd take it out, run my fingers over the stitching, and remember the woman I never met, the wife whose quiet philosophy still breathed life into the company through the choices we made. Daniel and I became friends. Sometimes, in the middle of a busy day, he'd pass me in the hall and sign a quick, playful message. Still being tested? And I'd answer with a smile. Always. Looking back, I realize now that what seemed like a spotlight was really a lantern. Grayson wasn't trying to expose me. He was trying to illuminate what was already there. The choice to see, to help, to honor even the smallest human need. And maybe that's the lesson for all of us. Not every act of kindness will be noticed. Not every moment of integrity will be rewarded. But each one leaves a mark on someone's heart, on the culture around us, on the legacy we build without ever meaning to. Because one simple greeting in sign language changed everything. So, if you take nothing else from my story, take this: your quiet choices matter more than you think. Someone is always watching, not with judgment, but with hope. And the smallest gesture, offered in humility, can echo further than you'll ever know.